Hello, everyone. Alright, today we are talking about the English coming to America, colonizing, and then some of the differences between the different colonies, some of their motivations for why they founded the colonies they do, to then take a look at maybe how things developed into the distinct regions that we have on the east coast of America today, and some of the cultural problems that we have as a result of some of these motivations. Let's get into it. So, the English settlement of the New World occurs later than the Spanish and the French, and one of the main reasons is they're distracted by civil war, the War of the Roses, and religious instability in the 1500s. And they venture into the Atlantic at first, preying on Spanish shipping. You've got a rise in piracy against Spanish ships, as well as the Royal Navy, who's trying to capture some of that wealth that Spain is bringing back from the New World. And you've got these swashbuckling English sea captains of the Elizabethan era. This is a little bit played up here, known as sea dogs, or adventurers who combine considerable maritime and military skill, allow them to seize Spanish treasure. The legendary figures like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, Martin Frobisher, and lesser names, they were pirates. Okay, these individuals were not savory, nice, kind people. We romanticize them. This is obviously romanticizing them here with some of the language being used. These are not the most savory of characters, the nicest of individuals. They're pirates who are there to steal what you have and kill you if you don't comply. These are not nice people. But when the English see the Spanish Armada coming, sorry about that, I've got notifications popping up on my iPad. So when the English see the Spanish coming across the sea to come and conquer England and take it over, the English, the Royal Navy, the Crown, makes a deal with a number of these pirates, and they actually end up knighting a number of them for services for the English Crown in helping defeat the Spanish Armada, and then they end up becoming a part of the English force thereafter in harassing the Spanish. Okay? You've got these grand sea battles that are happening at this time of great uncertainty at first, and then after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, you see the decline in Spanish power globally, and you start to see the rise of English power and French, but definitely of the English during this time period. So, early interests is shown in the Americas by individuals like Sir Walter Raleigh, who ends up funding colonies later on, but he wants to first establish bases on the coast to ambush Spanish trade, become more wealthy, and a question arises of why would English settlements eventually become more successful than their Spanish counterparts in the New World. And I think one of these main reasons is business practices. You have the Spanish, who supported essentially the feudal system in America, as opposed to the capitalist nature of English enterprise in the New World, because the English Crown was fairly hands-off, at least initially, as it came to businesses being established, and there was a real push for entrepreneurs and private companies to send people, try to make money, and individuals who are really motivated to gain wealth from their own hands. And then you've got a cultural, technological inquisitiveness. Inquisitiveness meaning curious. The reason they're curious is because they're in a new land in new surroundings, and they need to figure out how to survive in this, at least initially, in this very, very hostile place. I mean, a large percentage of the first settlers at places like Jamestown ended up dying as a result of starvation and brutal winters, not planning and preparing enough to provide for shelter, poor choosing of locale for whether they actually set up the first town. They set up near a swamp, and there was some problems here. And so in order to survive and then thrive and gain wealth and money from the land, they couldn't just pull it from the land like the Spanish were doing in places where they were mining for gold and silver. They had to find a way to be very resourceful and to gain their wealth from the land itself. And this promoted new invention and figuring things out because there's no other choice. Climate receptive to political and economic risk-taking is what I was just explaining. These individuals were going on this grand adventure to start this new life in the new world, and they didn't have a lot of resources that they brought with them, and not a lot was coming in, at least at the beginning. And so there's huge risk, but then if they're successful, there's potentially a huge reward as well. And maybe a little bit of luck as well, if you believe in that kind of thing. The colonists at Roanoke, who all died, definitely could have used some. So early English settlement patterns. So lesson learned from this early colony of Roanoke, ? Probably not. The reason Roanoke is brought up, at least is as far as I'm concerned in history, is because Sir Walter Raleigh, he funds this expedition, and this colony is founded off the coast, I believe of the Carolinas, Roanoke Island. And 2 years after leaving the island is deserted, and this Croatoan is written on the fort's gateway. Apparently it means something to the Native American people there. People are gone. There's a lot of speculation on what happened. But what we know for sure happened is that personal investors were not nearly as excited about funding expeditions after this. What results is in individuals who are willing to risk part of what they own, part of their finances, sorry about that, in starting this company. And you have the advent of joint stock companies. So a joint stock company is where one person and then another person and then another person and another person decides they want to pool their money and buy a part of a company. And then after they buy part of this company, the company has money to then invest in things like starting up a new colony. And back in this day, the stocks or the partial ownership of the company was actually written on an actual certificate and delivered to, or was given to the person who owned part of that company. And then if you wanted to sell your stock, you had to sell your physical stock of that company, the paper saying that you owned part of a portion of it, to another individual. And if the company ended up becoming very, very successful during the time that you owned that stock because of the money that you invested, you could then potentially sell that stock for a lot more money down the line. This is basically how the stock market works today. And these are the first major corporations. This is not the first company. You also have like the Dutch East India Company, which is a joint stock company. But this is the Virginia Company is one of those organizations that gets into the colonization business really early on because of this idea. Okay, and they pursue settlement of Jamestown in 1607. The primary motivation for settling at Jamestown was to make money, to make profit. And even with corporate backing, the settlers nearly made no money, at least at first, because they believed there was gold there. And so you had a bunch of individuals who were panning for gold. And we'll get back to that. So the Virginia Charter. is also a large portion of this. So the joint stock company, the Virginia Company, they send a group of individuals to start this colony, and they started in Virginia, and then they request a charter from King James the First. And this charter from King James, he signed a charter is authorization to operate. And so it's basically the king's blessing to operate in the New World, and there are certain liberties that are given to Virginia as a result of this. So the Virginia Charter, overseas settlers are given the same rights of Englishmen in England. And then there's the Foundation for American Liberties. Rights are extended to other colonies via this charter. There's freedom to experiment with government, and England sends the unemployable and unwanted to the New World. So this colony is really tragic in the way that they decided to organize the people who went. Again, we'll come back to that in a minute. So this is a selection from that charter. Reads thus: James, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, and France and Ireland, defender of the faith, etc., whereas our loving and well-disposed subjects make habitation, plantation, and to deduce a colony of sundry of our people into that part of America commonly called Virginia. And we do also ordain, establish, and agree that each of the said colonies shall have a council, which shall govern according to the laws, ordinances, and instructions as shall be in that behalf, given and signed with our hand or sign manual, and pass under the privy seal of our realm of England, each of which councils shall consist of 13 persons, to be ordained, made, and removed from time to time according as shall be directed, and comprise the same instructions. So it's really important from this selection is that the king authorizes the making and giving permission of councils to make their own laws and to govern the people. They were giving them the power to start up their own democracy in the New World. And later this charter is revoked, but the seed of democracy is planted as soon as these colonists are setting foot. Okay. The Chesapeake area, Virginia and Maryland, is the next section we're going to be talking about in a little bit more detail. So the settlement of Virginia is founded, like I said, by the Virginia Company, and they found Jamestown near a swamp, and there are mosquitoes in the swamp in the summer that then are giving people malaria. And the river near where they are, where they're getting the majority of their water supply, they are actually using the restroom upstream and getting things like dysentery, and it is not clean water. It's murky, gross, essentially swamp water that then is coming into their area. They are drinking, consuming, and getting very, very sick from in the summertime. And then the individuals that they brought, well, we'll discuss them in a minute, were not the best choices. Okay, so like I said earlier, the main goals were to find as much gold as they possibly can. They heard these stories for years and years and years about how the Spanish went to the Americas. They found a bunch of gold, and they became extraordinarily wealthy, inflating the economy in Europe as a result. And so their primary purpose is to go there, find gold, bring it back to the New World, or to the old world. I apologize, to Europe, and then convert Indians to Christianity, just like Spain. They said that was one of their mottos, though they didn't really do anything to actually do that. They mostly attacked the Native Americans and were very hostile towards them. There wasn't a lot of conversion happening. And the new passage to the Indies, they were going to try to look for that, because please remember, at this time, they couldn't send a satellite up into space and see the globe. Like, they didn't know what the world looked like in its entirety, and so they were still hopeful they'd find a Northwest Passage that would lead them to East Asia. Come to find out later on, it doesn't exist, but they were still hopeful at this time, and consisted of largely of well-to-do adventurers and like homeless people off the street. So you've got these gentlemen soldiers of 104 settlers. Half of them are considered gentlemen. Translation: they're semi-aristocrats who were there to serve as soldiers and at garrisons and military outposts designed to launch raids on the Spanish and fend off Indian attacks and things like that. And so, historically, in medieval European society forward, soldiers didn't farm, really, especially if they were coming from the nobility. Knights, back in the Middle Ages, their job was to fight. And they were fed by the people that they protected. And, this is kind of a feudal thing that in a classed society like England still was at this time, you had these aristocrats or semi-aristocrats that don't expect that they need to farm. They're going to be fed by other people. And a large portion of the other half are actually people they just vagrants they rounded up off the streets and brought with them, or they brought criminals and people like this, not the most savory of characters, to do this. Excuse me. Try not to sneeze. I apologize. Okay, I'm not starting the video over for that. All right, so not the best people to bring along. So the gentlemen are sitting around panning for gold and dreaming of this Northwest Passage and talking about how rich they're going to get, instead of actually farming to survive. And so the majority of them actually end up starving to death, and this happens for years. Huge problem. So it almost kills the colony. There's a failure of commercial interests in these initial years equals stranded settlers. The Virginia Company is not going to spend money to extricate or bring these people back to England until they start producing something. And when help does come, and they're so excited to be leaving the colony, they made them stay, and they just brought new people who were basically this, of similar demographics, who then also didn't want to work. It was pretty brutal for a decade or so. You've got personalities like Captain John Smith, who he was not the leader of this expedition. That was this was John Rolfe, but John Smith, he was a seasoned military veteran, and he got the people organized enough early on and told people, after their first winter, you have to farm. If you don't work, you will not eat. And they eventually just chased him out of the colony because they didn't like being told what to do by this guy and didn't like farming. So he ends up leaving a few years later. And then the new governor who comes and takes over is like, are you kidding me? These people are all going to starve and die because no one's doing any work. It just baffles the mind. I don't really understand. But that was the mentality at the time, and a lot of people died as a result. And then you've got John Rolfe, who says he's building a colony on smoke. He introduced a tough strain of tobacco, which becomes the cornerstone of the Virginia's economy. Now, John Rolfe gets a lot of, he's villainized in cinema. Often, he's the company man. He's sent there for the sole purpose of making the Virginia Company money. That's the entire reason why they're there. Though he does do something that's really creepy. The Pocahontas story that you probably know and love is a total sham. So Captain John Smith, he ends up being captured by the Powhatan Indians, and as a result, as I understand it, I could be wrong. If I am, someone correct me in the comments. But as I understand it, there was a group of Native Americans who ended up killing, a pig or a few pigs that the colonists own, and then in retaliation of that event, they murdered the Native Americans. And so this is the situation that in which John Smith ends up being captured by the Powhatans. And the story goes that Pocahontas comes out and says, "Please don't kill this man." But she was like a little girl at the time. She was, probably around 12. And there was never a romantic relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas. However, later on down the line, Pocahontas, she was, I think, about 17, ends up marrying John Rolfe, who is definitely way, way older. And then the ending of that story is they end up moving back to England, and Pocahontas catches a disease like many Native Americans did as a result of exposure to European diseases, and she ended up dying of disease back in England. So the story that you may know and love might be a little untrue. Okay, and then you've got the southern plantation colonies who end up being dominated to a large degree by plantation economy. Tobacco, rice, later cotton, and other cash crops are the primary things that are being produced and then sold back in England because they can sell for a lot more. I mean, tobacco is one of those things that it needs a very specific climate to grow well in, or to grow at all, and places like Virginia and the Carolinas are great places to grow tobacco. And so that's why this region becomes famous for that, and infamous because it brings in a huge amount of slave labor to the colonies to work this land and to do the kind of commercial farming they were trying to do without any modern farming equipment. Okay, John Smith, what a beard on that guy. All right, and then you've got John Rolfe, Pocahontas here. They got married. She died. It was kind of creepy. Let's move on. Okay, assessment of the Jamestown sealing. Some positive and negative things. Positive being the House of Burgesses, that first legislative assembly that King James, told them in the charter that they were allowed to have, where they are deciding on their own laws, etc. This was a positive thing. Expansionary attitudes, need for fresh land to compensate for degradation of existing lands. You could put this in negative, but all settlers practice some form of religious toleration. Church of England, the Anglican Church being the most prominent of them. And then, some real negatives. Racked by tragedy during the early years, you've got famine, disease, war with the American Indians, antagonism with the Powhatans leads to attacks on Jamestown. And then by 1609, you've got 400 settlers that come to Virginia. Only 60 of them survive what is called the Starving Winter of 1609 through 1610, where there are many accounts of like cannibalism. So the people who survived the Starving Winter, a lot of them were eating other people or digging up dead bodies and eating them. Absolutely horrifying stuff. It happened. And like I said, a lot of people died, and it was due to just poor decisions by the people who came, and poor leadership decisions on getting people to do things that would keep themselves alive. And this was kind of the result of a series of poor decisions. And by 1625, only 1,200 of nearly 8,000 colonists survived. Like I said, there was a lot of death. I mean, the accounts, like the first winter, like they didn't even bring enough supplies or have the means or knowledge to build themselves cabins or anything like that. there are accounts in these first few years where they're literally like digging holes in the ground and living in little hovels in like holes in the ground. Like, it's just crazy stuff. Okay, Virginia Charter ends up being revoked by James I in 1624 because he believed the assembly too seditious or not supportive of the monarchy and the things that the monarchy wanted, and also loathed tobacco. I want to note that King James I in 1624 knew that tobacco was bad for you. So if anyone tells you otherwise, like, they knew way back in the day that tobacco was bad for you and not a positive, healthy thing to be doing. But it was still marketed, and it's still a problem in society today. And Virginia becomes a royal colony directly under his control after he revokes this charter, though he still lets them farm tobacco, so nothing really changes. So this means that Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay turn into an unplanned attraction for a number of English Catholics. England is a Protestant nation. English Catholics refuse to abandon their old faith. They're persecuted for it, and they see a safe haven in the New World. Okay, and so you've got individuals like Sir George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, who gets a portion of Virginia for the Catholic haven and profit. Eventually, this is becoming Maryland. And there's it is eventually declared a safe haven for Catholic individuals, but a number of Protestants end up moving there, eventually outnumbering the Catholics there. But the Catholic individuals, fearing religious persecution, they end up getting everyone to pass what is called the Act of Toleration. Excuse me. So this act guarantees toleration to all Christian, but instituted the death penalty for anyone denying the divinity of Jesus, with one exception. So Jews, atheists, Muslims, Hindu people, anyone from any other religion other than Christianity, that denied the divinity of Jesus. So that would be deists would be out as well. With the exception of, and I want to note this, emissaries from the Ottoman Empire or traders from the Ottoman Empire. These were Muslim people, but no one wanted to anger the Ottoman Empire during this era because they had not yet found the Northwest Passage because it didn't exist. And the only way to get to, or one of the only reliable passages to East Asia was still through the Ottoman Empire, and they didn't want to start a larger conflict between the Ottomans and their nation by killing Ottoman individuals coming from that empire. Okay. The motive behind originally passing this Act of Toleration is to protect their faith by granting them a certain degree of religious freedom, and it becomes the settlement of Maryland ends up becoming the largest haven for Catholics in the British American colonies. Okay, and then you've got the American colonization that's interrupted during the English Civil War. So there's a steady amount of individuals coming in through the 1600s, which slows down almost to a halt during the English Civil War. One of the reasons for this is because a lot of the individuals who might have wanted to flee England for a new life in the New World were hopeful that the government would be overturned in England, things would get better, and all of their problems would be resolved from this conflict. So they stayed where life was as they knew it, in hopes that things would get better in their own country. That and ships are being used for other purposes during this time, etc. It's a little bit more complicated than I'm making it out. But the amount of settlers who were coming to the New World slows down almost to a halt during this time period, when Oliver Cromwell ends up taking power from Charles I, And it's not until the restoration of the monarchy, after Oliver Cromwell, he claims himself as the protectorate, basically the new king, after he overthrows Charles I. He ends up dying. His son takes over. His son's not very good at it. He ends up stepping down before they kill him, and they put Charles II, the next monarch in line for succession, onto the throne. And after this, there's a flood of individuals who head towards the Americas to settle and colonize. Okay, and new colonies are including the Carolinas, New York, and Pennsylvania. So the settlement of the South Carolina, very different from North Carolina and why they were created, is founded after the Restoration and named after Charles II, named after the king at the time. And the primary goals is to grow things that they can sell outside of the region for more money. Wine, silk, olive oil. These things don't grow very well on English soil because of the climate that is there. Rice becomes the main cash crop for export, and something that's very, very important to note is that by 1710, blacks outnumbered the white people that were there. And there is a fantastic book. I am totally blanking on the author right now, but there's a fantastic book called The Internal Enemy. I think it's by Allen. I can't remember at the moment. Someone knows, please leave it in the comment. But the Internal Enemy won the Pulitzer a few years ago. Alan Taylor, I think, is the name of the scholar who wrote this. And he talks about this, that there was a dread by the slave owners and the white individuals who lived in this area that were oppressing and enslaving all these black individuals who were either born in the Americas as slaves or captured from their homes, taken from their loved ones, put in chains, and made into slaves in the Americas. There was this fear, this dread of the internal enemy, the slaves that would rise up and kill all the white people. And part of that fear was because by 1710 in South Carolina, they actually outnumber the white people there. And so there's a real fear of this happening. Exported Indians as slaves to the West Indies and New England colonies, perhaps many as 100,000. So these individuals, they're not only enslaving people in their black people that they are from Africa, they're also enslaving Native Americans and sending them other places. I mean, some of the reasons for why they didn't enslave those people and keep them there and oppress those people as much. They did. They tried this. But it's a lot easier for a Native American who grew up in this region, who knows people and knows ways, knows where other tribes are, to walk away and escape and get to safety than it is for someone from sub-Saharan Africa on the coast to navigate, or someone who's been raised on a plantation their entire life and doesn't know any other life. It's very, very different. And so they're transplanting Native Americans and putting them in that same situation in someplace foreign to them. So Charleston, South Carolina, becomes the most active seaport in the South. You've got a huge natural harbor in the area. Now, North Carolina, totally different colony. They had slavery and stuff there too, but the reason why it was originally founded is if you've got poor white refugees, these are, in a lot of them, indentured servants who have served their time. So an indentured servant, someone would sign a contract saying that they were going to work for, I say, 5 years or 7 years for passage and payment of debts, and to have a home in the New World when they are for passage to the New World or whatever the contract was for. And they'd work these 5 or 7 years, and at the end of their contract, they don't have a lot of money, but they're free, and they're in the New World. Up until this point, they'd been treated like slaves, and I personally wouldn't want to hang around a bunch of people who treated me like a slave. I would want to leave, and so a lot of them did. They moved to, a lot of them go to North Carolina, and North Carolina is formed originally from basically a group of misfits. Religious dissenters, poor white individuals who were fleeing from the people, like indentured servitude. Not fleeing from indentured servitude, but, well, some bit of. But they're leaving after their terms are done, etc., and they're starting up a new life. And it becomes the most democratic, independent, least aristocratic of the original 13 colonies, similar to Rhode Island. Yet they treat Indians ruthlessly, sold many into slavery, and had slaves themselves. A student brought this up earlier today when we were talking about this concept. Like, how did these people who were treated like slaves themselves justify enslaving others? Like, I couldn't answer the question. I have no idea. Like, how did those people justify that? It boggles my mind. I have no idea. As a teacher, I learn stuff from students every day. They bring up insights that I've never thought of, and that was one of them. Like, how do those people justify that? I mean, it's just, slavery is terrible in and of itself. And you read some of the writings from back then, like, they knew it too, but it was so ingrained in the culture, they promoted it like it was a good thing. You can go into a lot of psychological analysis of why these people did the things that they did, but slavery in the American South was just barbaric. It was horrible. Some of the worst slavery the world has ever known. Yeah. Let's move on. Okay, so Georgia now. So Georgia is founded by James Oglethorpe, great name, as a haven for debtors, as well as a buffer state against the Spanish and Indian incursions from the South. The state that we currently call Florida today, that region was actually Spanish at the time. It was owned by and controlled by Spain. There are also a number of Native American tribes there. They're hostile to the English settlers, like the Senegal Indians and things like that. They're in this region, and so you've got a number of individuals who are down there, military individuals who are stationed and trying to protect against an incursion from the Spanish and Native Americans from the region. Savannah ends up emerging as a very diverse culture. You've got your Lutherans, Scottish Highlanders, not a lot of Catholics that are moving to this area. And the Scottish actually a lot of them end up going inland into the interior and settling in the Appalachian Mountains, and a lot of the people who live in the Appalachian Mountains are descended from like Scottish Highlanders, which is, I mean, I'm also descended from from Scottish Highlanders, and I think it explains a lot of why the stereotypes are what they are. Strong, independent people who don't want to be told what to do, and who stick up and support the people around them in their communities. Fiercely independent people, etc. A lot of the culture, it's very... I'm going to move on. Yeah. The stereotypes some of them are there for a reason. This is not everyone, but stereotypes can be useful. Not all the time, but they can be. Okay, Southern society in the 18th century. Okay, you've got class structure of Southern society. You've got plantation owners at the very top, small farmers who are not ruling over the plantation large swaths of land and have a ton of money. They're small farmers, subsistence farmers. They're maybe selling a little bit extra. They might own 1 to 2 slave, modest sized plots of land, not these giant corporate businesses essentially. And then you've got landless whites. Some are former indentured servants. Some are, individuals who, paid for passage, but they don't own any land in the area. And you've got indentured service, who are lowest of, the whites. They're essentially treated like slaves during their indentured servitude, for the majority, for the most part. The number of these individuals ends up decreasing as black slavery ends up increasing after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where you've got indentured servants who are not happy with their situation and trying to overthrow the current situation. And only black slaves are lower in the class structure, consisting of 20% of colonial population by 1775. And when it says colonial population, that's not like South Carolina, where they were actually the majority. This is all of the colonies. I want to note that the first year that slavery came to the South was the same year that it went to the North. This was an American problem. And when I say American, I also don't just mean what became the United States of America. What became the United States got a very small portion of the slaves that ended up being taken from their homes and transplanted forcefully to the Americas, meaning Central South America, much more actually than the United States. But difference being slavery looked a lot different in different places. And in the South, they actually ended up passing laws where if you were born a slave, you could not escape slavery, and then every one of your children and descendants was going to be a slave. I mean, it was brutal that they locked these people into this caste and gave them no hope for a better future. I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, it was just absolutely horrendous what was done to these people. So you've got a large portion of the individuals who are slaves, especially in the South or in these categories. You got some small farmers, and then you've got the plantation owners. That's the basic social hierarchy, kind of in a nutshell. So some key questions to look at. Why did the South remain underdeveloped during the latter years as the North ended up progressing? One of the reasons is few cities emerged, like large cities, because the focus is on agriculture and farming and these large plantations in Southern society, not on congregating in cities and developing industry. Okay? Like I said, life revolves around Southern plantation. The other thing, poor transportation. Waterways are the principal means for transportation. It's the best way to ship your crops and gain a profit. So less time, effort, energy is spent on developing transportation networks, ground transportation networks, than there was in the North. When the railways come along, this is very, very pronounced in that the Southern railroads were an absolute mess. They built railroads with different gauges all over the place, and so like during the Civil War, you have tracks that some are small and others are big, and what happens is you're going down the track, and then you need to change direction, but you can't have the train turn because the track width is a different size for the axles on the actual train. So you've got to then unload all of the goods, load them up on another train to have it go in a different direction. It was an absolute mess, and that's kind of indicative of how the roads were treated in the South. It was a little bit more haphazard, less planned. And how did they differ from England? Some general things. There's a demand for labor of indentured servants, like in the South. Demand for for labor of indentured servants in the South, and then later on, slavery. England didn't have nearly this problem. England's an island where they're not doing these style of large-scale farming operations that they were trying to start up in the southern United States. Women also come in smaller numbers, and so there are fewer women per individuals, and so there's a slower start as far as the people who are coming there to make money, these plantation owners, and then because there's not as much women, not as many people being born, there's not enough labor to actually do the work. They ended up taking the easy way out, or I guess I don't know how to phrase this. This is just absolutely terrible, but they ended up, to solve their problem of not having enough people to work the land, they captured people, they imported slaves and bought slaves from slave traders, and that becomes the primary labor force in the South. So some big ideas. Contrast the Chesapeake and Carolina regions, where they're actually two Souths. I would argue probably yes. I mean, especially with North Carolina, you've got very different purposes for why it was being developed originally than, say, Virginia with the Chesapeake. South Carolina was also very, very different culturally, at least initially. And then some things to do: trace the development of indentured servitude and black slavery in the 17th and 18th century. This would be a great research topic and question. And to what extent was 18th century Southern society different from 17th century Southern society? This chapter 18, see chapter on 18th century. Yeah, I forget which chapter that is, but it is covered in our textbook. And each region of the English settlement undergoes a transition from a radically different model towards a convergent on a generally English model. A lot of the laws that they ended up adopting originally are thrown out in favor of English common law. And all of this is not going to be possible the way that it turned out without slave labor. The rapid growth, development, the overtaking of the Spanish as far as the economy would not have happened at the rate it did without importing slaves from Africa. And the greatest asset of the British colonial America is the immensity of the land, and the deficit is the shortage of hands to develop that land. So instead of taking the hard road and the morally right road and working to develop your population to the point where you have enough people naturally to do all the jobs that need to be done, they enslaved people to make this happen. And they'd be shocked back in the day to hear my shock and horror that they did these things, but it is shocking and horrifying to me. Okay? Some more big ideas. The British government shows little interest in sponsoring immigration. Those who do immigrate are often the least prepared or most antisocial. They literally were rounding up vagrants from the street and sending a lot of criminals for religious or other reasons, like what I just said. The alternative to cheap labor was forced labor. Colonists already in America paid for the importation of convicts, beggars, prisoners of wars, and indentured servants to get someone over there to work the land. And the colonists we're talking about are the rich, powerful, semi-aristocrats that don't want to work. These are the guys who were panning for gold at the beginning because they didn't want to do anything. And were literally willing to starve to death before they actually picked up a shovel and did anything. They're willing to do whatever they need to do as far as taking advantage of other human beings in order to continue a life of leisure. These are the type of people that we're talking about. And the colonists turned an existing trade in forced labor in the form of slaves carried by Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch traders. This slave trade has already existed in this form for decades with the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Dutch. This is not a new thing that starts with the English coming. This is already an established thing that has been going on for quite some time now. Colonies developed their own domestic slave trading industry based on the Middle Passage, centered on Newport, Rhode Island. And slavery becomes the key point for that creates the success of these southern colonies, but is the moral shame of America. And it really is. I mean, it's the moral shame of America, and I think it's important to address like that. That the things that were done to these people are still having effects on society today and are unexcusable. And I think they need to be addressed. We need to have some empathy and compassion for people who, even generations afterwards, are being affected by some of these decisions that were made a few hundred years ago. And to reach out with love and care and empathy for these people to try to make their situation better. And I'm not talking about like protesting in the streets or anything like that. Though if you want to protest, sure. But I'm talking about things like what I'm doing here is trying to educate people on what happened so that you can come at and have a conversation with individuals out of a place of love, care, empathy, compassion for another human being whose families were raised in a very, very different way than yours might have been raised, and to understand some of the historical background so that you can enter into conversation with these individuals from a place of empathy and compassion as opposed to anger and antagonism. Thank you for watching to the end of this video, if you have done so, and have a fantastic day.